Maybe next year we should order takeout instead, my daughter-in-law Claire said with a soft laugh as she pushed my sweet potato casserole away from her plate. Some recipes should retire with the people who made them. The room went quiet after that. Not completely silent. Silverware still clinked against china. Football commentators still echoed from the television in the living room. But there was a shift in the air at that Thanksgiving table, the kind you can feel in your chest before anyone else notices it. I sat there with my hands folded carefully in my lap, staring at the casserole dish I had carried into Claire and Daniel's home less than an hour earlier. The marshmallows on top were still perfectly toasted, golden brown the way my late husband Thomas always loved them. For 38 years, that casserole had been the first empty dish at every Harper family Thanksgiving. This year, nobody touched it. Claire lifted her wine glass and smiled at the guests seated around the dining room table. Her friends from the country club laughed politely, though a few of them avoided looking directly at me. My son Daniel stared down at his plate like the green beans suddenly required his full attention. Sophie, my 16-year-old granddaughter, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Claire," she muttered quietly. "Grandma spent all morning cooking." Claire waved one manicured hand dismissively. "And that's sweet. Really. But we're trying to modernize Thanksgiving a little. Lighter food. Cleaner ingredients. Not everything needs to taste like 1987. A few awkward chuckles floated around the table again. I smiled gently and reached for my water glass before anyone could notice the trembling in my fingers. Outside the dining room windows, snow drifted softly across the backyard. Inside, the scent of rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles mixed together so heavily it almost made my stomach hurt. Claire had spent weeks preparing this dinner. She mentioned it constantly in family group texts. The floral arrangements. The imported wine pairings. The private chef she almost hired before deciding it would look more authentic if she cooked herself. But by noon that morning, she had called me in a panic because the turkey was still frozen in the center. So I drove 20 miles through freezing rain carrying half the Thanksgiving meal in aluminum trays balanced carefully across the back seat of my Buick. I had saved her dinner. Now she was performing for her guests. "Evelyn still cooks like she's feeding construction workers in the 80s, Claire continued, cutting into her tiny serving of turkey. "Daniel grew up on cream, butter, casseroles. Honestly, it's amazing the man survived childhood." This time, several people laughed harder. Claire smiled wider. She loved an audience. I looked toward Daniel, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he only cleared his throat and took another sip of wine. That hurt more than Claire's joke ever could. Widowhood teaches you strange things about silence. It teaches you how loudly people can ignore your pain while pretending everything is perfectly normal. Ever since Thomas passed away 2 years earlier, I had slowly become less visible in my own family. Claire replaced traditions one by one, like changing decorations in a house she planned to sell. Christmas brunch became ski trips with her friends. Sunday dinners disappeared entirely. Even Sophie's birthday parties moved to expensive restaurants where nobody over 60 could comfortably hear the conversation. Still, I kept showing up. Because mothers do that. We continue loving people long after they stop making it easy. Claire suddenly leaned back in her chair and smiled directly at me. "Oh, Evelyn, I almost forgot to tell you." Her tone brightened theatrically. "I officially start Monday morning. Vice President of Community Partnerships." Several guests applauded politely. Claire practically glowed under the dining room chandelier. "That's wonderful," I said softly. And then she mentioned the company name. "Lawson Hospitality Group." My hand paused halfway toward my water glass. Richard Lawson. I had known Richard for almost 20 years. I sat beside him on the advisory board for the Harper Culinary Foundation. Last spring, he personally asked me to help review executive candidates for his company's new expansion program. Claire had no idea. None at all. She smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table, completely certain she held all the power in the room. I smiled back just as calmly. Because in that moment, I realized something Claire Harper had never bothered to learn about me. Quiet women notice everything. The drive home felt longer than usual that night. Snow collected along the edges of the windshield while the heater in my old Buick hummed softly against the cold. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel and focused on the road ahead, even though Claire's voice still echoed in my mind. Some recipes should retire with the people who made them. Funny how a sentence can follow you into silence like that. By the time I pulled into my driveway, Most of the neighborhood had gone dark. Christmas lights already glowed along roof lines, even though Thanksgiving had not officially ended yet. The Mitchell family across the street still used those oversized colored bulbs that looked like something from 1972. Thomas always loved those lights. He said modern Christmas decorations had no soul. I sat in the car for another minute after turning off the engine. The casserole dish rested untouched in the passenger seat beside me, wrapped carefully in the same floral kitchen towel I had brought from home that morning. $30 worth of sweet potatoes, brown sugar, pecans, butter, and marshmallows. 6 hours of cooking. Nobody had taken a second spoonful. I finally carried the dish inside my house through the quiet front porch, balancing my purse against my hip while searching for the light switch. The moment I stepped through the front door, the silence wrapped around me completely. That was the hardest part of losing Thomas. Not the funeral, not the paperwork, not even learning how to sleep alone after 40 years beside someone. It was the silence afterward, the kind that waits for you inside the walls of your own home. I placed the casserole on the kitchen counter and slowly removed my coat. The house still smelled faintly like cinnamon and cedarwood from the candles I burned earlier that morning before leaving for Daniel's dinner. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago. Thomas's reading glasses still rested beside his recliner in the den because I could never bring myself to move them. His old University of Michigan mug still sat on the second shelf near the coffee maker. Some people call that unhealthy. I call it marriage. I loosened my earrings and glanced toward the dining room. The table there looked smaller these days. When Daniel was young, Thanksgiving dinners filled every chair in the house. Thomas carved the turkey while football played too loudly in the background. Daniel used to steal olives off the vegetable tray before dinner started, and I would pretend not to notice. Later, when Sophie was little, she used to sit on the kitchen counter helping me roll pie crusts while flour covered both of us from head to toe. Back then, family traditions felt permanent. I understand now that traditions only survive if people value the person holding them together. Claire never cared about the recipes themselves. She cared about replacing the woman attached to them. At first, her changes seemed harmless enough. Different napkin colors at Christmas, reservations instead of home-cooked birthdays, catered brunches instead of Easter dinners. But over time, I started noticing something deeper underneath it all. Claire did not just want modern traditions. She wanted ownership of the family narrative itself. The old photographs slowly disappeared from Daniel's house. Thomas's framed military picture vanished from the hallway one spring. Claire replaced it with abstract artwork that looked like spilled paint. She once referred to my china cabinet as clutter from another century, while standing 3 feet away from me. Daniel laughed nervously at the time and changed the subject. That became his specialty after marriage. Silence disguised as peacekeeping. I opened the refrigerator and carefully placed the untouched casserole beside the leftover cranberry sauce I had made earlier that week. The refrigerator light cast a pale yellow glow across the kitchen tiles. Suddenly, my phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Sophie. "Grandma, I am sorry about tonight. Mom was being mean again." I stared at the message for several seconds before replying. "It is all right, sweetheart. Happy Thanksgiving." 3 dots appeared immediately like she was typing again, then disappeared. A moment later, another message arrived. "I do not think Mom knows who you really are." I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter after reading that. Outside, snow continued drifting quietly past the windows. Somewhere deep inside me, beneath the loneliness and embarrassment and exhaustion, something colder had begun settling into place. Claire believed age had made me powerless. That was her first mistake. I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing at the kitchen window holding a cup of chamomile tea that had already gone cold in my hands. Snow covered the backyard in a smooth white blanket, untouched except for the crooked line of rabbit tracks near the fence. Thomas used to wake up before sunrise after every Thanksgiving just to shovel the driveway before I even asked. "A gentleman clears the path before his wife needs it," he would say with that quiet smile of his. Some people leave behind money when they die. Thomas left habits. The next morning, I moved through the house slowly, still wearing the heavy silence from the night before. I folded blankets in the living room, watered the plants by the dining room window, rearranged the stack of Christmas cards that had started arriving earlier that week. Small things, quiet things, the kind of routines that keep loneliness from settling too deeply into your bones. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Richard Lawson's name appeared across the screen. I stared at it for a moment before answering. "Happy Thanksgiving weekend, Evelyn," he said warmly. "I hope I am not interrupting family time." I almost laughed at that. Instead, I walked toward the kitchen and leaned lightly against the counter. "Not at all, Richard. I wanted to thank you again for helping with the executive review process last month," he continued. "Your instincts about people have saved this company more than once." I glanced toward the refrigerator without meaning to. Claire's untouched casserole sat behind the milk carton exactly where I left it. "You give me too much credit," I replied softly. Richard chuckled. "No, I do not. Half these candidates look polished until you put them under pressure. That is when character starts leaking through the cracks." Character. Funny word. Everyone loves talking about it until it costs them something. Richard continued speaking about onboarding schedules and holiday travel plans, but my mind drifted back to Claire sitting proudly beneath that chandelier while humiliating me in front of strangers. Some recipes should retire with the people who made them. I could still hear the laughter afterward. Controlled. Polite. Worse because nobody stopped it. "Claire Harper starts Monday, correct?" I asked carefully. There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes," Richard replied. "You remember her?" "I do. Impressive resume. Strong presentation skills. Very ambitious." Ambitious. That word fit Claire perfectly. She carried ambition the same way some women carry expensive perfume. You noticed it before she even entered the room. "Daniel must be proud," Richard added casually. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug resting beside me on the counter. "I imagine he is." Richard lowered his voice slightly. "You sound tired, Evelyn. Everything all right?" For a second, I considered telling him everything. The Thanksgiving dinner. The jokes. The humiliation. The years of subtle insults disguised as sophistication. But something stopped me. Maybe pride. Maybe exhaustion. Or maybe I simply wanted to understand who Claire truly was when nobody forced her to behave better. "It was a long holiday," I answered finally. Richard did not push further. He never had to. One reason I trusted him was because he understood silence. Before ending the call, he added, "We are hosting a small leadership reception Monday afternoon after orientation. You should come by if you feel up to it. The foundation partnership means a great deal to the board." "I will think about it," I said. After we hung up, I stood motionless in the kitchen for several seconds. Then I opened the refrigerator and stared again at the untouched casserole dish. 38 years of family tradition reduced to leftovers nobody wanted. Slowly, I lifted the dish out and placed it on the counter. The marshmallows had hardened overnight. I picked up a spoon and took one bite cold. It still tasted exactly the same. Sweet potatoes, brown sugar, vanilla, cinnamon, home. Suddenly my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Claire herself. "Thank you again for helping yesterday. Sorry if the evening felt stressful. Hosting can be overwhelming." I read the message twice. Not an apology. Not really. Just another performance wrapped in polished language. I typed a response carefully. "Of course, Claire. Family gatherings can bring out surprising sides of people." 3 dots appeared almost immediately on the screen, then disappeared. No reply came after that. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and looked around my quiet house. For the first time in a very long while, I no longer felt invisible. I felt underestimated. And there is a difference between those two things that some people learn far too late. Monday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. The kind of cold that settles into your joints before you even step outside. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror fastening the small pearl earrings Thomas gave me on our 25th wedding anniversary. They were simple earrings. Nothing flashy. But Thomas used to say elegance should whisper, not shout. Claire would have hated that philosophy. Her world was built on being noticed. Mine had always been built on noticing. I buttoned my navy wool coat slowly and glanced at the framed photograph resting on my dresser. Thomas stood beside me in that picture outside our first restaurant fundraiser almost 19 years earlier. Back then, the Harper Culinary Foundation operated from a rented office above a bakery in downtown Grand Rapids. We only had enough funding to sponsor 3 women-owned restaurants during our first year. Thomas handled accounting at night, while I spent weekends organizing charity dinners and mentorship programs. We built the foundation one relationship at a time. Not through money, through trust. That was something Claire never understood about power. Real influence rarely announces itself at the dinner table. By 11:30, snow. drifted lightly across downtown sidewalks as I parked outside Lawson Hospitality Group headquarters. The building itself rose 30 stories above the city, all steel and glass and polished marble. Young professionals hurried through the revolving doors, clutching coffee cups and laptops, while security guards nodded politely near the entrance. 20 years ago, places like this intimidated me. Not anymore. The receptionist smiled the moment I stepped inside. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harper." "Good afternoon, Melissa. Mr. Lawson asked me to send you directly upstairs once you arrived." I thanked her softly and stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection briefly in the mirrored walls. Silver hair neatly pinned back. Straight posture. Calm expression. Claire saw an aging widow clinging to outdated recipes. She never bothered asking who I became after everyone else stopped paying attention. The executive conference floor smelled faintly of fresh coffee and cedar polish. Soft instrumental music drifted quietly through hidden speakers overhead. Employees moved quickly between glass offices carrying folders and tablets while assistants arranged trays of pastries near the reception area. I recognized several board members immediately. Most greeted me warmly the moment I entered. "Evelyn, so glad you came. You look wonderful." Respect has a sound to it. Quiet, effortless, genuine. I had almost forgotten what that sounded like. Richard Lawson appeared moments later, tall and silver-haired in a charcoal suit. "There you are," he said warmly, kissing my cheek. "I was beginning to think you would skip today." I considered it. His expression softened slightly. "Everything all right?" Before I could answer, the elevator doors opened behind us. Claire stepped out smiling confidently beside two members of the onboarding team. She wore a cream-colored designer suit with gold buttons and carried herself like someone walking toward the future she believed she deserved. Her smile lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she saw me standing beside Richard Lawson. I watched the confusion hit her first, then recognition, then something colder underneath. Both. Her steps slowed almost immediately. Claire Harper, one of the executives beside her, said cheerfully, "We are excited to officially welcome you aboard." Claire barely heard him. Her eyes stayed locked on me across the reception area while color slowly drained from her face. Richard turned politely toward her. "Claire, I believe you already know Evelyn Harper." The silence afterward stretched uncomfortably long. Nearby employees pretended not to notice while absolutely noticing. Claire recovered quickly, at least on the surface. That was one of her talents. "Of course," she said carefully. "Evelyn is my mother-in-law." Richard smiled warmly. "And one of the most respected advisors this company has ever worked with." I saw it then. The tiny crack beneath Claire's polished confidence. Small, almost invisible, but real. Suddenly, every Thanksgiving joke sounded different in her head now. Every dismissive comment, every smirk, every moment, she treated me like decorative furniture from another generation. Claire forced a tight smile toward me. "You never mentioned you worked with Lawson Hospitality." "You never asked," I answered gently. Richard glanced between us briefly, sensing tension without understanding it completely. "Well," he said lightly, "today should be exciting for everyone." Claire nodded stiffly, though her eyes never fully left mine. For the first time since Thomas died, I watched someone finally realize they had mistaken my kindness for weakness. And the thing about that kind of realization is that once it begins, panic usually follows close behind. The leadership reception began an hour later in a private conference lounge overlooking the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the entire downtown skyline, while waiters moved quietly between guests carrying trays of sparkling water and small appetizers arranged too perfectly to actually satisfy anyone. Conversations floated softly through the room in polished corporate tones. Expansion plans, market trends, partnership opportunities. The kind of discussions where everybody smiled while carefully measuring each other's value. I stood near the windows with Richard Lawson discussing scholarship. Funding for the Culinary Foundation when I noticed Claire across the room speaking with two senior executives. From a distance, she looked composed again. Confident posture, elegant smile, controlled gestures. But I could see the strain underneath it now. Every few seconds her eyes drifted toward me. Fear changes people in subtle ways. It sharpens their politeness until it almost cuts. "You certainly surprised her earlier," Richard said quietly beside me. I took a sip of sparkling water before answering. "I do not think Claire expected me here." "Apparently not." His expression turned thoughtful. Although now that I think about it, she seemed unusually nervous during final interviews whenever we discussed community leadership or mentorship work. I remained silent. Richard studied me for a moment longer. Is there something I should know? Before I could answer, a young assistant approached holding a tablet. Mr. Lawson, the media team needs your approval on the presentation slides. Richard nodded politely and excused himself, leaving me alone near the windows. A few moments later, Claire appeared beside me. Her perfume reached me before her voice did. Expensive, sharp, cold somehow. You could have told me, she said quietly, still smiling for appearances as nearby guests mingled around us. I kept my attention on the city skyline below. Told you what? About your connection here. Again, I replied calmly. You never asked. Claire's jaw tightened slightly before she relaxed it again. I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot over the years. That almost made me smile. Corporate panic had entered the room now. You mean Thanksgiving? I asked softly. Her eyes flickered. I was joking. Were you? Claire folded her arms lightly across her designer blazer. Evelyn, I hope you understand how stressful hosting can be. People say things sometimes. I turned toward her then, meeting her eyes fully for the first time all afternoon. Yes, I said gently. They usually say exactly what they mean when they feel comfortable enough. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Around us, glasses clinked softly while executives laughed near the catering tables. The entire room remained polished and civilized on the surface. But underneath it, something colder moved quietly between us now. Claire lowered her voice further. Daniel does not even know you are involved here. No, I replied. He does not. Why keep it secret? I glanced toward the river below where snow drifted lightly across the frozen sidewalks. Because I never needed my family to admire me in order to help people. That landed harder than I expected. Claire looked away first. Before she could respond, Sophie's name flashed suddenly across my phone screen. Excuse me for 1 second, I said politely before answering the call. Grandma. Sophie sounded nervous. Are you busy? Not at all, sweetheart. Is everything okay? There was hesitation on the line. Then she spoke quietly. Mama's been freaking out since this morning. Dad too. I closed my eyes briefly. Sophie. I did not tell them anything, she interrupted quickly. But Mom keeps asking why Richard Lawson knows you. She made Dad leave work early just to talk about it. Nearby, Claire stood completely still, pretending not to listen, while clearly hearing every word. You do not need to worry about grown-up problems, I told Sophie gently. Focus on school. Sophie lowered her voice even more. Grandma, Dad said Mom might lose her job if somebody important complains about her behavior. I looked directly at Claire as Sophie spoke those words. Her face had gone almost completely pale now. Nobody loses opportunities over one bad dinner, I answered carefully. People lose opportunities because of patterns. Claire swallowed hard beside me. Sophie exhaled shakily into the phone. I just do not want everybody fighting again. My chest tightened slightly at that. Children always carry the emotional bills adults pretend do not exist. Everything will settle down, I said softly. I promise. After hanging up, I slowly slipped my phone back into my purse. Claire stared at me silently for several seconds before speaking again. You would really destroy my career over Thanksgiving dinner? I held her gaze calmly. No, Claire. Your career will depend entirely on whether the woman from Thanksgiving dinner is the same woman standing in this room right now. And for the first time since I met her, Claire Harper looked genuinely unsure of herself. By the time I left the Lawson building that evening, the snow had turned into freezing rain. Downtown traffic crawled slowly beneath glowing brake lights while icy wind rattled against the sides of my Buick. I drove home in silence with both hands steady on the wheel, but my mind stayed fixed on Claire's face after our conversation near the windows. She had looked frightened, not embarrassed, not defensive, frightened. There is a difference. Embarrassment worries about appearances. Fear worries about consequences. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the porch light had already switched on automatically against the dark. The little brass numbers beside the front door still reflected faintly from the headlights, just as they had for 26 years. Thomas installed those numbers himself one October afternoon while Daniel held the ladder steady below him. Some memories stay so clear you can still hear the sound of the drill against the brick if you close your eyes long enough. Inside, the house felt warmer than usual. I hung my coat carefully near the door and noticed the blinking light on my answering machine immediately. Hardly anyone used answering machines anymore. But I kept mine because Thomas always trusted hearing someone's actual voice more than reading text on a screen. I pressed the button slowly. Mom. Daniel's voice filled the kitchen. Tight. Uneasy. Please call me when you get this. There was a pause before he added quietly. Claire told me you were at Lawson today. The message ended there. No warmth. No questions about how I was doing. Just tension wrapped in politeness. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment staring at the blinking machine after the recording stopped. Then I walked to the refrigerator and removed the leftover casserole dish again. The marshmallows had sunk completely overnight, forming a soft, sugary layer over the sweet potatoes underneath. I scooped a small portion into a bowl and warmed it in the microwave while the answering machine blinked silently behind me. Grief changes your relationship with food. After Thomas died, I spent almost a year cooking meals for 4 people out of habit before remembering there were only 1.5 left in the house now. Me and memories. That was the strange thing about marriage after 40 years. Even empty rooms still felt occupied somehow. My phone rang just as the microwave beeped. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Mom. His voice sounded exhausted already. Claire said you embarrassed her today. I almost smiled at that. Interesting version of events. Silence stretched briefly across the line. In the background, I could hear cabinet doors closing somewhere in their kitchen. Claire was probably nearby listening. Why did not you tell us about your connection to Lawson Hospitality? He finally asked. You never asked. I answered calmly, repeating the same words I gave Claire earlier. Daniel exhaled sharply. Mom, come on. No, Daniel. You come on. My voice stayed soft, but something colder settled underneath it now. I spent 19 years helping build partnerships for the Harper Culinary Foundation. I attended your father's charity dinners. I sat through board meetings while you were still learning algebra. None of that was hidden. You simply stopped paying attention. Another silence. This one heavier. Claire is terrified, he admitted quietly. I carried the warm bowl toward the dining room table and sat down beneath the soft yellow light overhead. Is she? Mom, please do not do this. Do what exactly? Mess with her career because of Thanksgiving. I looked down at the casserole in front of me. Cinnamon, butter, brown sugar. The same recipe Claire mocked in front of strangers. Daniel, I said gently, your wife humiliated me in front of an entire room of people. She was joking. There it was. The same excuse. Again. I closed my eyes briefly. Do you know what hurts most? I asked softly. It is not even Claire anymore. It is how quickly you defend cruelty when it comes wrapped in confidence. His breathing changed slightly on the other end of the line. That is not fair. No, I replied quietly. Thanksgiving was not fair. The house fell silent. Around me except for the ticking clock near the hallway. Finally Daniel spoke again, his voice lower now. Claire worked really hard for this opportunity. I glanced toward Thomas's empty chair at the far end of the table. So did I answered. For decades. Neither of us spoke after that. Somewhere beneath the tension, I could hear something fragile beginning to crack between us. Not anger. Something sadder. Disillusionment. Eventually Daniel cleared his throat quietly. What happens now? I rested my hands around the warm ceramic bowl and stared at the steam rising gently into the air. That depends entirely, I said softly, on whether your wife understands the difference between influence and intimidation. The next 3 days passed quietly on the surface, but underneath everything, tension spread through the family like hairline cracks in glass. Daniel stopped calling. Claire stopped texting entirely. Even social media went strangely silent. No cheerful photographs. No inspirational quotes about gratitude or family. Nothing. It would have been almost peaceful if not for the constant feeling that everyone was waiting for something to happen. Thursday afternoon, I stood in my kitchen decorating sugar cookies with Sophie over a video call. She balanced her phone against a cereal box while carefully spreading blue icing across a snowflake-shaped cookie in her family's kitchen. Mom and Dad barely talk right now, she admitted quietly while concentrating on the icing. Every conversation turns into an argument. I pressed small silver sprinkles into the edge of one of my own cookies before answering. Adults sometimes struggle when reality interrupts the story they tell themselves. Sophie frowned slightly. That sounds like something Grandpa would say. I smiled at that. Thomas always had a way of sounding wise without trying too hard. Your grandfather understood people very well. Sophie hesitated before lowering her voice. Mom cried yesterday. My hand paused slightly over the cookie tray. Did she? I have honestly never seen her cry like that before. Sophie glanced over her shoulder toward the hallway before continuing. Dad told her she embarrassed the family. Something heavy settled quietly in my chest after hearing that. Not satisfaction. Not guilt either. Just sadness. There is a point in every family conflict where nobody really wins anymore. Your mother is under pressure right now, I said carefully. Pressure reveals character, sweetheart. Sometimes good things. Sometimes painful things. Sophie nodded slowly. Do you hate her? The question landed softly, but directly. Children always ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. I looked down at the half-decorated cookies spread across my kitchen table. No, I answered honestly. I think your mother got used to believing power means making other people feel smaller. And now, I smoothed icing carefully across another cookie before replying. Now she is learning that respect works differently. That evening, just after sunset, headlights swept across my living room curtains. A car door slammed outside. Through the front window, I saw Daniel climbing slowly out of his SUV alone. He stood in the driveway for several seconds before walking toward the porch like a man preparing for bad news at a hospital. I opened the front door before he knocked. Cold air rushed inside immediately. Hi, Mom. Come in, sweetheart. Daniel stepped inside quietly, brushing snow from his coat sleeves. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. The lines around his eyes reminded me painfully of Thomas during his final year. Stress changes men differently than women. Women tend to harden. Men tend to fade. I made coffee, I offered. That would be nice. We sat together at the kitchen table where I had spent most of my adult life feeding people who no longer noticed the effort. The same wooden table. The same soft yellow light overhead. The same clock ticking gently near the stove. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee mug without drinking from it. Claire thinks you are trying to ruin her career. And what do you think? He stared down into the coffee for several seconds before answering. I think I should have stopped her years ago. That surprised me enough that I said nothing at first. Daniel exhaled heavily and rubbed one hand across his forehead. I kept telling myself she did not mean things the way they sounded. That she was stressed, competitive, trying too hard to fit in. He laughed once bitterly. Truth is, I just did not want conflict. Outside, wind rattled softly against the kitchen windows. Avoiding conflict does not prevent damage, I said quietly. It usually protects the person causing it. Daniel nodded slowly like he already knew that. Richard Lawson called me this morning. My eyes lifted toward him immediately. He did. Not officially. Just casually. Daniel swallowed hard. He said leadership positions require emotional maturity and professionalism both inside and outside the office. I remained silent. Daniel finally took a sip of coffee before speaking again. Claire is terrified they are reconsidering her role. The sadness in his voice reached me more deeply than anger would have. Because beneath all of this stood my son. Tired. Confused. Caught between loyalty and truth. Mom, he said carefully. Did you tell Richard what happened at Thanksgiving? I met his eyes calmly across the kitchen table. No, Daniel. He looked genuinely surprised. Then how does he know something is wrong? I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my hands together. Because decent people can usually sense disrespect long before anyone explains it. Daniel stared at me quietly after that. And for the first time in many years, I think my son finally understood that silence does not always mean weakness. Sometimes it simply means someone has stopped wasting words on people who were never listening. December settled over Michigan quietly after that. Snow covered the neighborhood rooftops almost every morning, and Christmas lights glowed softly against frozen sidewalks by 5 o'clock each evening. From the outside, everything probably looked normal inside the Harper family. But families rarely collapse loudly at first. Most of the time, they unravel in silence. One canceled dinner invitation at a time. One tense car ride. One conversation that suddenly stops when somebody enters the room. Claire officially started her position at Lawson Hospitality the following Monday, but something had changed. Richard never removed her from the role. He never threatened her either. In fact, he treated her with complete professionalism every time I saw him afterward. But Claire no longer walked into rooms with the same effortless confidence she once carried like armor. Accountability unsettles people who spent years believing charm could replace character. A week before Christmas, Sophie came over after school while Daniel and Claire attended what she called another terrible couples therapy appointment. The poor girl tried to sound casual saying it, but I heard the exhaustion underneath. Teenagers should worry about algebra tests and winter dances, not whether their parents still love each other. She sat cross-legged on my living room floor wrapping Christmas presents while old jazz records played softly in the background. Thomas loved jazz during the holidays. Dad sleeps downstairs now, Sophie said quietly while taping silver ribbon onto a gift box. My hands paused over the mug of hot chocolate I was holding. I am sorry, sweetheart. She shrugged, though her eyes stayed fixed on the wrapping paper in front of her. Honestly, they mostly argue about you. That sentence landed heavily between us. Your mother blames me for what is happening, I guessed softly. Sophie nodded once. Dad says none of this would matter if she had just treated you with respect in the first place. Snow drifted quietly past the front windows while Bing Crosby played low through the speakers near the fireplace. For a moment, the house felt painfully peaceful compared to whatever tension waited inside Daniel's home every night now. Do you know what is strange? Sophie asked suddenly. Mom used to say family image was everything, but now she cares more about what people think at work than what is happening at home. I looked toward the Christmas tree glowing softly in the corner of the room. That happens sometimes when people spend too much energy performing instead of connecting. Sophie frowned slightly. Do you think Dad still loves her? Children ask heartbreaking questions so gently sometimes. I chose my words carefully. I think your father loves the version of your mother he hoped she was. Sophie grew quiet after that. Later that evening, after she left, I stood alone in my kitchen washing dishes while snow tapped softly against the windows. The radio played old Christmas songs low in the background. Thomas used to dance with me in this kitchen every December while waiting for pies to bake. Nothing dramatic. Just one hand on my waist while humming slightly off-key. Funny how the smallest memories survive grief the longest. My phone buzzed suddenly against the counter. Claire. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. Hello, Claire. Her voice sounded thinner than usual somehow. Less polished. Evelyn. I was wondering if we could talk. I dried my hands slowly with a dish towel before responding. We are talking. A strained exhale came through the line. I mean in person. Silence settled briefly between us. Finally she spoke again, softer this time. I do not think Daniel looks at me the same anymore. That sentence carried more honesty than anything she had said in years. I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. Respect is difficult to rebuild once someone watches you use cruelty casually. Claire's breathing shook slightly. I made mistakes. Yes, I answered gently. You did. Another silence followed. Then quietly, almost like she hated admitting it, Claire asked, why did not you destroy me when you had the chance? I looked around my quiet kitchen. The Christmas cookies cooling beside the stove. Thomas's old coffee mug near the sink. The reflection of soft tree lights against the dark window. Because humiliation changes people less than self-awareness does, I said softly. Claire said nothing after that for several seconds. Then finally, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from her before, she whispered, I do not think I knew how cruel I sounded until I heard it reflected back at me. I closed my eyes briefly. Sometimes the saddest part of family betrayal is realizing the people who hurt you never truly believed they were capable of doing it. The following Thanksgiving arrived quietly, almost without warning. 1 year earlier, I had walked into Daniel and Claire's dining room, carrying aluminum trays full of food and hope, still believing effort alone could hold a family together. This year felt different from the moment I woke up. Lighter somehow. Outside, thin snow covered the neighborhood lawns while pale November sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen curtains. I stood at my counter rolling pie dough while cinnamon and butter warmed the house with familiar scents Thomas once loved. The radio played old jazz records again. Some traditions survive because they deserve to. Others disappear because they were never built on kindness in the first place. Around noon, Sophie arrived wearing a thick wool coat and carrying grocery bags against her chest. I brought extra whipped cream, she announced proudly while kicking snow off her boots near the door. I laughed softly. Now it truly feels like a family holiday. She smiled wider than I had seen in months. College applications and family tension had aged her slightly over the past year, but something steadier had returned to her lately too. Peace, maybe, or simply honesty. We spent the afternoon cooking together in my kitchen while the turkey roasted slowly in the oven. Sophie peeled potatoes while I prepared stuffing beside the stove. Every so often she stole pieces of celery from the cutting board exactly the way Daniel used to when he was her age. Funny how certain habits survive generations, no matter how complicated families become. Around 3 o'clock, the front doorbell rang. Richard Lawson stood on the porch holding a bottle of sparkling cider and wearing a dark winter coat dusted lightly with snow. "I hope I am not too early," he said warmly. "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside so he could enter. Richard had become a quiet but steady presence over the past year. Not romantic. Life at my age no longer craves grand reinventions. But companionship matters. Respect matters. Having someone look at you as though your thoughts still hold value matters more than people realize after 65. Sophie hugged Richard warmly before returning to the kitchen, carrying bowls toward the dining room table. The house felt full again. Not crowded. Not performative. Just warm. Honest. By 5 o'clock, candles flickered softly across the dining room while snow drifted steadily outside. We gathered around the table together beneath the same chandelier Thomas installed 20 years earlier after insisting every proper dining room deserved warm lighting. There were no country club guests this time. No polished performances. No nervous laughter after cruel remarks disguised as jokes. Just food. Conversation. Quiet comfort. Halfway through dinner, headlights swept slowly across the front windows. Sophie looked up first. Then me. Daniel stood alone on the porch when I opened the door. He held a pecan pie awkwardly in both hands like a peace offering he was not entirely sure he deserved to bring. "Hi, Mom." He looked older than he had a year ago. Softer too. Grief does not only come from death. Sometimes it comes from realizing too late who you became while trying to keep someone else happy. "Come inside," I said gently. Daniel stepped into the warmth of the house and glanced briefly toward the dining room, where Sophie and Richard sat waiting quietly. "I did not want to interrupt," he said. "You are not interrupting." He swallowed hard before speaking again. "Claire and I separated 2 months ago." The words settled quietly between us. Sad but unsurprising. "I am sorry," I answered honestly. And I was. Not because I missed who Claire had been, but because broken families leave bruises on everyone involved. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. "She transferred to another branch in Chicago." Snow melted slowly across the shoulders of his coat, while cold air drifted through the doorway. "She asked me to tell you something," he added carefully. "She said you were the first person who ever made her understand that humiliation and power are not the same thing." I closed my eyes briefly after hearing that. Somewhere deep down, I hoped it was true. Daniel handed me the pie awkwardly. "I know I failed you for a long time," he said quietly. I kept choosing comfort over courage. The honesty in his voice sounded painfully familiar. Thomas once told me the hardest thing for decent people is admitting when silence helped cruelty survive. I stepped aside from the doorway fully then. "Dinner is getting cold," I said softly. Daniel looked at me for a long moment before nodding once. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and laughter drifted softly through the living room again, I stood alone for a moment near the kitchen window, watching snow fall across the backyard. 1 year earlier, I thought losing respect inside my own family would destroy me. Instead, it taught me something far more valuable. Love without dignity eventually becomes grief. But respect, real respect, has a way of rebuilding even the quietest parts of a person.